Jamie Cool is with us today on the Azure DevOps podcast.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome back to the Azure DevOps podcast. Go online to www.azuredevops.show to see show notes and other episodes. Today, we're talking about what's going on with Azure DevOps. To discuss this is Jamie Cool. He's the Director of Program Management for the whole product, managing dozens of program managers all around the world, shipping loads of features on the platform. Jamie, how are you?
I'm doing great. Just got back from Thanksgiving break, which is very recharging. So looking forward to the new week.
Did you take the whole week off or just a few days?
I took almost the entire week off. There were a couple of meetings that I just had to go and do because, we have folks from around the world. We did an all hands for India actually on Tuesday. But for the most part, I got to take the whole week off. It was good times.
Nice. Now, are you a turkey or a ham guy?
I am definitely a turkey guy. Thanksgiving is turkey and Christmas is ham. That's the way it is.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, there's so much going on in the DevOps world and also with the Azure DevOps product. And before we get into that, how did you end up in your current role, and what's your trajectory been up to this point?
Yeah, it's interesting, the path, that you go through in life. But at this point, I've been at Microsoft now for 20 years. When I first was interviewing coming out of college, right? There was an option. Do you want to be, when I interviewed with Microsoft, you want to be a PM? You want to be a dev? You want to be a tester, right? And everywhere else wanted to hire me as a dev. And I'm like, what's this PM thing? I'll give it a try and interview with Microsoft. And I'm like, that's exactly the perfect role for me. And I spent 10 years in Redmond. I worked on all kinds of fun projects. I worked on Exchange Server for a long time, back when it was really competing, against Lotus Notes as the main competitor. And I spent most of my time in DevDiv in different forms. I worked on Windows Forms. I built Click Once, as an install technology. That was, a fun time. It still amazes me the billions and billions of installs people are still doing with that.
Yeah.
Over the years, worked on Silverlight, which was a lot of fun when we were working on it. Didn't quite have the ending that I had hoped for it, but had a lot of fun while we were doing with it. And a lot of good things came out of that. But then about 10 years ago, I got to the point where I'm from the East Coast and I was ready to move back to the East Coast. My oldest child was about to start school. I started trying to figure out what to go and do. And it turned out that Brian Harry, who I had worked with back on the .NET Framework 1.0 days, he was the PUM of the product unit manager for the CLR. He'd started a small site in North Carolina. This is where he's from. Mm-hmm. He originally bought SourceSafe, right? And then Microsoft bought that. He moved out to Redmond, then he moved back. He started a site, which was, basically the foundation of TFS, when we were first building that up. And it was in the area that I was looking for. So I ended up joining this TFS team about 10 years ago. And it's turned out to be an incredibly exciting space because if you look at, over the last 10 years, what's happened? One, just the amount of energy that has gone in development tools across the entire energy industry has gone through the roof, right? The phrase software is eating the world is absolutely true. And then the amount of energy that is going into making the lives of developers better is going up exponentially. And I've gotten to be, continue to be a big part of that because that was one of the things I loved in my previous roles when I was in Redmond. That was still in the development division inside of Microsoft. So it was, again, my customers were developers. It's kind of who I understood. So that's been a lot of fun. The other thing that's happened is that the whole services wave has taken off, right? So it used to be that we had really an on-premise server that you would get and you would install and you would ship a new version of that every 2 or 3 years, right? That was the ship cycle. In fact, I can remember, when I was working on different parts of Visual Studio, there would be this is the month where you can't install Visual Studio and we're just gonna have to wait for a good installer, next month, right? Type of phase, right?
Yeah.
It gets worse than that. I remember I was in the Exchange team. And so I was on the innermost dog fooding ring. So it'd be more like, oh, this is one of those weeks where you don't get email. Got it. Right.
Oh, wow.
So, you go through all of that, but now the service is waived and we ship dozens of times every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And so the time to get product out and get feedback from customers is just totally changed. And like the engineering that you do and the way that you work is totally different from how you build an on-premise product to how you build a service. So I've got to kind of go through both of those. And, in that phase, in the TFS, the STS, now Azure DevOps team, I've been playing a role, again, centrally, in the areas most oriented towards developers. So being responsible for the version control spaces, the CI, CD pieces, most of the things that are the parts of the product that the developer persona uses the most is what I've been responsible for the most over time.
That's quite the journey. And I think the whole Microsoft space and all the people using Visual Studio, and I've certainly been developing with Visual Studio for over 20 years. It's transforming at a pace that's much quicker than the previous decade. And it's just, you guys are on fire with all the stuff you're pushing out. I think there's some blog posts and videos of the internal Microsoft DevOps transformation that's been going on. How's that going? What's finished, and what's the roadmap look like for what you guys are doing internally?
Yeah, we kicked off this effort 4 or 5 years ago. We refer to it as, one ES, one engineering system internally, but really it was a push, and it started in large part with Satya, with the declaration that with Microsoft, we wanted to have the best engineering system in the industry, right? And there were 2 reasons for that. One reason is just, hey, if you want to be successful in the space, it's about how fast you can move, how fast you can ship software. And if you can't move fast, you're not going to be successful. We've seen evidence of that, both the good and the bad, over the years. And, to do that, you have to have a great engineering system. And so we wanted to really invest in that. The other thing is that it turns out that engineering systems are really important to developers. And whether the developer is going to be happy and motivated and whether they're going to join your team and want to stay on your team is largely impacted by how good an experience the actual development process is. If them writing code and like building the change and validating the change takes a long time and is really hard and error prone, then they're not going to be happy, right? Because they're not going to be satisfied. So that was a big thing. So we kicked off this initiative, and Azure DevOps are really the central set of tools that are powering that. And a lot of the innovation that we've been doing over the years around making our tools and our system great for Microsoft for internally had been then shipped externally. And now at this point we've got 97,000 users each month that are internal to Microsoft that use Azure DevOps to ship our software. These numbers go up so fast, but I think we run 500 million tests every single day using Azure DevOps internally. We deploy 87,000 times every single day with Azure DevOps. And those numbers, you hear me pausing on them because they go up by 20% month over month. And part of that is because the journey that you go through is kind of twofold. One part of it is onboarding different teams and getting them to the tools that are going to help make them more productive, right? And now we've onboarded the Bing team or the SQL team or the Office team, right? You go through that so you get more folks using it. But then the next phase you go through is once you're able to, once you've made the investment, then you can start shipping more often. Then you start, shipping faster and doing these things with greater cadence inside of the teams that have onboarded. So, we have onboarded most teams inside of Microsoft, not all of them yet, because it takes, I know lots of customers that it's the same thing externally as it is internally. You've got different products that, sometimes the effort to go do the move, you're not willing to go, you don't have the ROI for it, or you have the ones where the ROI is there, but you have to find the time and the energy and the inertia to go do that. And this has been, I think, one of the things that I've seen characteristics of very successful teams, that they find the time and energy to make those investments because they're the type of things that they don't pay off next week. but they pay off over the long run. And if you don't make those investments, then you don't get that return. And and worse, they kind of cascade on each other, because like the longer you go with making an investment, the harder it gets to continue to make the investment, next as part of it. So all the teams at Microsoft are at kind of different levels of onboarding and where they are as part of it. Like some of them, like everybody obviously has, great CI. Everybody has lots of tests, but even with tests, like, if I look back at just the tests for my product, like 3 years ago versus today, we had tons of tests, but now we have tests that are very well factored into like L0, L1, L2 tests, so that, the tests, that we run on every single pull request are super fast, super reliable, and then we can run them on every single pull request, right? Versus the tests that are going to take like 45 minutes to go and run. We still run those all the time, but only when they get deployed to master. Like they're a different level of tests as part of it. And getting to that like is a different transformation. I think different teams are all on different journeys around test and deployment, sides of things. But we're really happy with how that's been going. And I think I'm especially happy with the work that we do in those areas, how they then, get to pay off and translate to other customers. I was doing a demo 2 weeks ago to some external customers about this new feature we have coming in pipelines, which basically makes it so that you can have compliant pipelines, right? Like, which means that like if you wanted to make sure in this particular organization, every pipeline has credential scanning in it, period, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to rely on the person authoring the pipeline to do it. You can just make sure that that's built in. And the customer that I was showing that to was like, going like, that's exactly what I want. And the reason why we built that is because it turns out the Azure team needs that.
Wow. That's a lot of change. And that's a lot of tests. Just out of curiosity, is it all, what's the distribution of tests and technologies? I'm sure the listeners are thinking, all right, is it in unit? Is it X unit? Are we using Selenium? Are there any other tools I need to think about?
Okay, I'm going to let you in on a dirty little secret. So it used to be, I mentioned before when I was interviewing for this job, there were 3 disciplines at Microsoft: PM, Dev, and Test, right?
Yep.
And the core product team. Now there's only 2, PM and engineering. About 2 or 3 years ago, we merged the disciplines together. It turns out that's pretty critical for being able to ship software faster. Like the devs need to be responsible for the quality of the code. If not, there's this weird kind of secondhand thing. So when we had a test team, one of the things that when you have a test team that's kind of universal, at least it was at Microsoft, is I've never met a test team that didn't, want to have their own test framework. So over the years, like we have just an innumerable number of individual test frameworks and test libraries internally at Microsoft. So if you were to go get the distribution of them, like I would start saying names that, like Mad Dog, right, that you wouldn't recognize, that, are internal to different teams. The Windows team uses that one, the Office team uses that one, type of thing. That's another kind of change that's been gradually going on as part of this. And I think more and more of them use MS Test as the core runner, but then the frameworks that you can use can be anything, NUnit, XUnit, as part of all of that. And there's not really a prescribed, what you need to use, test framework inside of the company right now.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I can see how when you split the teams organizationally, they all start to branch out and do different things.
Yep.
So what are the next big shifts for the Microsoft transformation that you're currently working on, but that not quite where you want it to be?
It's been interesting. You talk about Microsoft transformation. The other thing so I've been here 20 years, right? And it's been interesting for me over those 20 years to see, the things that have shifted and changed and where we've succeeded, and where we've struggled more as part of it. And, like when I started 20 years ago, Microsoft, I think you would describe it primarily as a consumer company. And then the big thing the first 10 years that I think Microsoft did a really good job at was becoming much more of an enterprise company and, understanding that customer base, because 20 years ago we didn't, right? And, over that journey we've been on, like we really do understand the enterprise more. We've kind of built that muscle, built that customer base, in a stronger way. And then, I think but at the same time, I think we missed a bunch of things that were kind of obvious in the consumer space. And there were things that, maybe weren't the right strategy or the right philosophy, and how we approach things over the past. And it's been interesting the last 6-7 years to see this other transformation that we've been going through. Internally, we often talk about it as like this new Microsoft. And it means a lot of different things, right? Like it means, it means not proprietary, not locked in. It means like, what does the customer want? Like, let's just kind of like see where the customer's at, what the customer wants, and like do the right thing for what that customer needs. And it's been fun from my standpoint. Like you can go across the company, you can see lots of different evidence of this. Like if we're going to have an Office client, of course it should run on iPad and it should run on Android and those sorts of things. Oh, PowerShell, like why can't that run on all the platforms? And there's just countless. In Azure, of course it should run Linux VMs. Like there's like dozens and dozens of these. For mine, like one of the fun things that I was part of was the Git transformation. Because, you go back 8 years ago and we're trying to decide what we do in the distributed version control space, it wasn't entirely obvious, like what we should go and do, right? Like, should we go do Git? Should we go embrace Mercurial, which was actually better on Windows at the time by a lot? Should we go take, traditional Team Foundation version control and make it more distributed in field type of thing? It seems like an obvious answer now as part of it, but it wasn't obvious back then. And but we decided, what customers are telling us is they want Git, right? Like that's the model they want. That's what they want. So we're going to go and embrace Git. And it was actually hard. Like we were the first product to ever ship a GPL v2 licensed piece of software, which, we had to go break down the barriers in the legal department to go do that. So that's been, that was exciting, right? Like, and that was kind of like, part of leading this new Microsoft. The one that we're currently working on now has been around OSS and CI/CD. So, with pipelines, we've just verticalized or componentized. Verticalized is again the word we use internally to refer to this, but componentized our traditional product into separate individual services. So you can choose whichever one you want. And pipelines is our CI/CD offering, and as part of that, we're really going after making OSS projects great. And making OSS projects great, like being able to support them. It doesn't make us money, right? Like it costs me money. In fact, it costs a lot of money to go basically use compute VMs to do build, right? Like for free, essentially. And yet, I'm very motivated to go do that because it just feeds into what we've been trying to go do from a company perspective to meet customers where we are and to be able to provide value where we can provide value. And I've been really excited and encouraged by kind of the need and opportunity in that space. So that's kind of where the energy is going in. And it's exciting because we've got hosted Mac and Linux and Windows pools for all of them. So if you want to be able to do an open source project or just a public project and get your CI for free, you can go and do it. And you can do it for any platform. And it's funny, like we have this really, really strong cross-platform offering. And, as a from Microsoft, if I go back in 10 years ago, like that would have been a crazy offering. In fact, 10 years ago, my build agent only ran on .NET, which means it only ran on Windows, which means you couldn't even build a Linux, build or a Mac build, right? So it's just been night and day. And this ongoing kind of transformation to be about more where customers are and what we can do for them has been one of the big things that I'm excited about.
Well, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor.
The Azure DevOps podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
And we're back with Jamie Cool. You were talking about the open source support. Does public projects also rope into that, or how else are you guys supporting open source software?
Yeah, so basically any open source repository that you have, right? And basically the definition of that for us is very liberal. It essentially means if that repository, wherever it is, and most of them are on GitHub, is public to the world, right? Meaning you can go see it because you're not authenticated, then you can use Azure DevOps services against that for free, right? So CI/CD with pipelines is the most interesting example today. So if you want to go set up a free CI system, free CI for that project, you can. If you want to use our deployment parts of it to deploy as well, you can do that for free. We have plans to expand this as well. So one example that we intend to go do is add kind of public unauthenticated support for Azure Artifacts, which is our package management system. So if you want to use that as a storage for your outputs of your build, or other scenarios with Azure Artifacts for your open source projects, you're going to be able to do that as well.
Oh, that's huge, because the Azure Artifacts has been one of those extra licensing things for what Visual Studio Pro versus the enterprise subscriptions. That's amazing.
Yep.
So you had mentioned Git, and now with the GitHub acquisition complete, at least the news has reported that it's complete. What's going on there?
Yeah, so GitHub continues to be its own independent entity, essentially a subsidiary inside of Microsoft. So, the biggest thing from our standpoint is just to make sure that GitHub is amazingly successful. And I can say from my standpoint, the GitHub acquisition is the most exciting thing that's happened since I've been at Microsoft, and I've been in the developer space in Microsoft for 18 years now. And just the energy and enthusiasm inside of Microsoft and the organization around the GitHub acquisition is great, because it really is the developer's home. There's so much kind of like goodwill and so much of like what you think of as this positive energy around the future of software. Like I mentally associate with GitHub because it's tied to open source and kind of the good spirit and goodwill and and community of those folks coming together. So that is part of Microsoft in some form is incredibly exciting. From an Azure DevOps side of things, I think the thing that's exciting too is that, one of the big things that we did in September was essentially relaunch, Visual Studio Team Services and Team Foundation Server as Azure DevOps. And, one of our goals there was to essentially componentize TFS and DSTS into a set of individual services. So if you just want a CI/CD offering, you can just come in and use pipelines. If you just want an artifacts offering, you can use Azure Artifacts. If you just want planning, you can use Azure Boards. And to getting to that point where you as a developer, as a user, can choose what the set of things that you want to be able to use, that was the goal, right? And that also helps us be able to reach more and more folks. Because a lot of times I talk to folks and the all-in-one solution is very appealing for them. And I have, millions of customers that, that is exactly what they want and are using it that way, which is great. I talked to lots of folks that have a very specific problem and they want a solution for that. And they want to know what we can do to help them and putting it in a form that, makes it so that they have the choice of how they want to use it has been very powerful. So then you put that in the context of, the GitHub conversation. And it means, if you want to use GitHub with Azure Boards and Azure Artifacts and Azure Pipelines, you can do that. The open source offer that we're doing, became even more exciting when you pair it up with, GitHub and the offers that we're putting out as part of this. You also still have the choice, though, if you want to use Azure repos, pipelines, boards, artifacts, all of it all in one. So really, the user just got a bunch more choices in terms of how they do this, and that evolution of our offering fits really well with GitHub as part of it. So I'm really excited to have GitHub part of the family.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that every open source project on GitHub could have a free build and publish to NuGet pipeline.
It is indeed.
So that's a lot of stuff to to even cover. What's the evolution of DevOps and the developer experience? Where do you see it going?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Going back in time again, when I first joined this team 10 years ago, the statement's going to sound crazy, but it's true. 10 years ago, about half of the users I would talk to don't use version control. Like you were still onboarding people to use version control for their software. And 10 years ago, probably about a quarter of them were using Visual Source Safe as their main source control system. And this was many years after Microsoft had basically put Source Safe into maintenance mode. So where folks were at was, to put it mildly, a very immature state. And then you start talking about like, do you have an automated build, right? Like maybe some people had some automated builds. That was becoming like kind of the newer process, right? Having a CI build, that was exciting, right? And, automated tests, automated deployments, like forget about it, right? Like that was a very different world. Right. Now you fast forward today, everybody uses source control. Like not everybody, but like basically everybody uses source control. Most people have some kind of automated build, right? In some form, not for every project, but for most of them, even if it's just like a nightly build that tries to, run whatever was, checked in that day. A lot of people, though, are still trying to are working on making that process more sophisticated and working to make it so that, it's not just that they're checking in and then they're having some auto validation. It's so that they're having it so that before they get checked in on the pull request or on the code review, they get an automated build to go and run as part of that. And so, but most people are there as are at least kind of in some realm of that. And then where a lot of folks are is working on their tests, right, and trying to get their tests into a really good shape, to pull in as part of that. And then if you're doing good, then the place that you're at is working on automated deployment. And if you're doing really good, then you've got it so that you can, you could deploy, you could take a change, get it validated, get it, into your master branch, get it automatically deployed to some kind of test environment, and validate that in some form. And if it passes, then proceed through whatever your deployment is, out to your other environments as part of it, right? That's kind of where you start to get into the point where there's not a lot of folks that are much better than that. So like if you're listening to this and you're doing things that are better than that, you should feel pretty good. But I suspect most folks listening are somewhere along that spectrum for most of their projects. But then kind of the next phase on this is, and a lot of the things that I can see where folks are going are a lot of the places I see internal teams inside of Microsoft trying to go for the next set of steps, because they, a lot of times they're running a little bit ahead, I find, in terms of just the level of investment and those teams are able to go and make in some of these spaces. And trends I see there are a couple fold. Like one is just getting more sophisticated in the deployment practices, right? So getting rich advanced feature flags. So you deploy all the time, but that has nothing to do with, what features show up. You just have really good capabilities in terms of being able to turn features on in and out, right? And that lets you do different forms of A/B testing, right? Because A/B testing is kind of an overloaded term, I find, in this space, right? Like A/B testing sounds really good, and it is really good in some places, right? It's really good for like, should the price be 99 cents or $1.99, which one maximizes revenue, right? Because you can just do, simple experiments there. But if it's like, should I build this feature or that feature? Let's A/B test that, right? Like you can't really do that unless you've built both features, in which case, like,
right,
kind of a high investment to go and do that. So there's definitely times where A/B testing, even in feature development, makes a big difference, but it's much more nuanced as that. But feature flags are universally applicable, right? Because the whole thing about the whole transformation I mentioned before, hey, this was the month I can't install Visual Studio 15 years ago, right? Those months sucked, right? It's because all those devs were merging in all that code, and it would just break, right? Because then you install the thing and it wouldn't work, right? But if you have a system where all those devs can be merging in code, and it's fine because all the code that they merged in that's behind feature flags that isn't working right, doesn't impact the mainline path, then they can just keep doing that, right? And they can keep shipping it. They can flip it on for their small subset of test users that they want to do and iterate on it, and then progressively more roll it out. So I think that progression is getting richer and richer. I think in the CI/CD space, the problem of having a really rich system that makes it great for automating your CI and your tests in a phenomenal experience where you can analyze test results and find flaky tests and all those kind of things. I feel like we're getting close to having that problem solved really well with pipelines and getting a nice stable place from that. The next opportunity is really on the deployment side of things, right? Deployment is kind of a hard problem, right? Because how do you do your deployment? Well, I guarantee you, if you were to just enumerate all the folks listening to this and have them describe how you do deployment, you would get an innumerable set of different models for how you can go and do it. Right? It's very involved, but at the same time, that makes it immeasurably complicated, right? And why so many of the deployment scenarios are not automated for so many folks. And the more opinionated we can get with deployment. So we did this some with agent-based deployments for VMs, where hey, the pattern is you put our set of agents on the VMs you want to deploy to, and we will take care of downloading your app, running your scripts that you've specified, running your tasks, doing that. You tell us how you want it to roll out all at the same time, one at a time, like what failure conditions you want. Like, well, we got opinionated on that. You're going to see us doing more and more of that. Containers are a huge opportunity on that, to get opinionated on, like, okay, you're doing a container-based deployment. That makes the problem much more constrained, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because you build the container, and part of building the container encapsulates like 80% of the deployment problems itself, right? Because it's got the app deployed on it that you want. But then the next stage is that, making it easy to do the rollout about that, and then be able to have kind of the experience from the pipeline of producing the container to the deployment of the container to where it's running, all of that kind of be tied together in a richer way. And, like the canonical thing that, my customers like always react the best to is the traceability, right? Is hey, here's my work item that I started work on, and I can see it traced from the work started to the commits, to the pull request, to the build, to the test, to the release, all of those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
And now if you pull in and deployed and the environment, right? Like, and here's, this work item and then where that work is, and there it's running on that environment and that cluster, in that Kubernetes cluster, for example. I think making those scenarios richer and better is kind of the next phase of where I see this stuff going.
That's awesome. You mentioned containers. Right now, for containers, well, people are it's been Linux heavy, and the Windows side is still kind of nascent. Do you see containers being the way to package up an application, even if the destination were Azure PaaS at some time in the future?
I think containers are day by day becoming more and more the canonical way to package up an application, right? Like, it's just a nice logical chunk for doing that. And you're right, like Linux has been running out ahead and, blazing a trail on that space. And, the scenarios for that are, have been kind of running ahead. And Windows has kind of a different set of scenarios that it's really good at, and the Windows containers are getting better each sprint as part of it. But there's no doubt that as a like, if you just think about like the problem with deployment, like one of the biggest problem has been like, what is the app package, right? And even if you define an app package, like let's take a NuGet component, right? Like, it's a package, it's got a manifest, It's got files, like it's got that in it, right? Like I mentioned, I worked on Click Once. It has exactly that. It has a manifest and a set of files, right? Whoop-de-doo, right? Like, what about your dependencies?
Yeah.
Right? Like, what about your configuration, right? Like, that's like the hard problem in all of this more than anything else. And guess what? Containers solve that.
So the audience for this podcast is Visual Studio development teams. And so if you give them some guidance on what they should be using now, but then also what they should be keeping an eye on for the future, what guidance would you give them?
I mean, I think my biggest advice would be, for that audience is, if you're using .NET, make sure you're using .NET Core, because it sets you up for the future, because you have all kinds of options when you're doing that. In fact, I'm just looking out the window of the room that I'm in now, and there are multiple engineers that are actually porting some of the stuff that we've written over the years in the .NET framework to .NET Core. It's going to give us a bunch of perf gains. It's going to set us up better for the future. And it gives us the option to, basically run some of our services on Linux VMs and Kubernetes in Azure, but also ship our on-premise product on a Windows box. So, like, I think that would be my biggest piece of advice right now. If you haven't made that switch, think hard about it.
Okay. And if for containers specifically, because there's a lot of folks that have that question, if they're in Visual Studio and if they're in .NET Core on SQL Server, but their entire company, of course, has been Microsoft shop, Windows everywhere, and so they're still targeting Windows, but they haven't moved to Microsoft Core. When would you advise them to switch to Windows containers?
I think, if Windows containers meets their needs, like if they can take their application and they can put it into a Windows container and it does everything they need it to go and do as part of that. In fact, that's an exercise that we've been through in different forms over here. Then doing that gets you to the point where you have an encapsulation of your app that then is easier to deploy and manage in many ways than, because the alternative is essentially having to run the infrastructure in some form, even if it's Azure infrastructure, and then via different mechanisms, including the one I talked about before, the pipelines has built in to help you get the application out there. Like you can do it that way, but if you can encapsulate everything into one container, one package, one format that makes it easier, like hey, just spin up that container and you've got your application. It solves a lot of problems. There are always nuances in terms of like what your application needs to go and do and how you're deploying it and those sets of things. But if you can do that, then there's a lot of possibilities for that.
And before we go, is there anything else that our listeners should follow up on?
Well, I think if you're interested in Azure DevOps, the best places to stay up to date on that, you go to azure.com/DevOps. Off of that site, it has links to all of our docs, our news feeds, our feature timeline for what's coming up, as well as our release notes, because we still ship major releases and publish updates for what's changed on the service every 3 weeks. You can follow Azure DevOps on Twitter. There's a steady stream of news going on that, as well as the Azure DevOps channel on YouTube.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jamie, for visiting with me.
All right. Sounds great. It's been a lot of fun.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.